With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. Okay. So, let's just see here. So we are presently then in the 8th chapter of Treasury of Precious Qualities. And we're looking at the practice of the Bodhisattva, which has two aspects, the bodhicitta of aspiration and the bodhicitta of application. And as we're studying this, the bodhicitta of aspiration, then we've covered, but now we're looking at the bodhicitta of application, which really means how we actually go about doing this. How do we, as persons that would like to follow the Mahayana path, engage? And that's where we're looking at this practice called paramita, which is the practice of those things that take us beyond ego, take us beyond our delusion, our sort of confused solidification, rigidity around our subjective person. And that rigidity is what we call ego. And then the rigidity around our perceptions, which is then the phenomena that we experience as solid. And you know, just recently I was reading something from a brilliant French philosopher, Michel Bitbol, who's been very active in the dialogue between Buddhist science and modern science. He's French. Those of you who can read French, you should read Michel Bitbol. But he made some very interesting observation at one point in one of his papers, where he says, you know, in the Western science, there's been this idea that there's substance and that our reality has substance. The Buddhists actually find that no, there actually is no substance. What we have is perceptions and the appearances that are actually just a web of ever-changing causes and conditions. And that's where we understand this both applies to the subjective dimension of who we are and also everything that we perceive. All that we have is just a web of causes and conditions. And as such, the solidity that we attribute to the self, the solidity that we attribute to the phenomenal world, is actually a flawed perception. And it's actually this ignorance that keeps us in samsara. So anyway, the paramitas, they're all, you could say, exercises and practices that softens this. For example, the first paramita, generosity, already softens the tightness around mine. You know, to give is already to go beyond me and mine, and so on. So the various paramitas gradually are more and more subtle in terms of working with this condition of our ignorance. And again, ignorance here is not like we're supposed to know something as if, you know, it's sort of like a challenge or a sort of equation that we should know. It's simply that this ignorance is what drives suffering. So we want to actually get to the bottom of this. And we're presently in the most subtle, but also the most important of all the paramitas, which is the paramita of wisdom, which is understanding the nature of reality. And that is where we're then discussing the various teachings that the Buddha gave, because there's not a single of the Buddha's teaching which are not really intended to dismantle all the teachings we have from the Buddha are without exception intended to dismantle our confusion. But you know, the Buddha then gave various teachings according to various individuals. And we talk about the expedient teachings, and we talk about the definitive teachings, teachings that are taught in order to sort of facilitate that we could get there. And then there's the definitive teachings, which is actually talking about the naked nature of reality. But the thing is, the definitive teachings are quite subtle and sometimes very difficult to grasp. So we actually need the expedient teachings that actually operate from where we are. And they really constitute more what we could say the skillful means that facilitate, you could say, the process. So that's where within the expedient teachings, we're then now looking at two categories, which is one, the implied teachings and the indirect teachings. And I'd like to say the difference of these is actually it's yeah, one is sort of more particular to, you could say, particular situations of you could say confusion, and the others are, you could say, teachings that work with the, you could say, difficulty around the teachings, and so as such they sort of are more teachings that operate with gradually easing the audience into a greater understanding. But you could say the first one, the implied teachings that we're looking at here, are more sort of intended to specifically eliminate some confusion that crop up. Anyway, I've sort of been sitting here really trying to to get my head around the difference between these two. And for me, they both seem, pretty, in some way, pretty similar in that they are all about just simply enabling individuals to gradually ease them into a greater understanding of the nature of reality. But also this is where you could say the Buddha's teaching differs from just what we call philosophy, because it takes so much into account the individuals and how they understand things. And it's so much about experience. It's not just, if you sit down and read a philosopher in the Western context, very often they're very difficult to understand. And also they very often just have one way of presenting the material. Whereas the Buddha, we actually say the Buddha taught 84,000 different teachings. 84,000 different, what we call entrance doors to the Dharma. So that's where the Buddha, as a teacher, was more interested in actually facilitating experience rather than provide some philosophy that just sits as one body of, you could say, a statement about, whatever the philosopher tends to think. So that's where we have so many different teachings, and that's where it is very helpful to understand how they all operate with different, you could say, from different perspectives. Anyway, presently then we are in the stanza 118, and let me just read that again. We've already read it last time, but just to reiterate. 4 kinds of implied teachings. Okay, we're going to talk about two kinds of expedient teachings. One is one is implied and the other is indirect. Then it says here, 4 kinds of implied teachings have been taught, and all of them achieve the aim intended. Teachings that imply the equality of all phenomena reveal that even opposites are one. Some teachings which imply another sense reveal that if things are examined, they are found to be unreal. Teachings that imply fulfillment at another time declare the effortless achievement of enlightenment. Teachings given for certain individuals are intended to humiliate their arrogance. So we've covered the first 3. Now we're looking at the implied teachings that's intended to humble pride and arrogance. And yeah, okay. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, teachings for the humbling of pride and conceit. Yeah, not arrogance, conceit. And he writes, seeing that people are barred from liberation by the pride they take in their practice of generosity, the Buddha belittled it, saying it was demons' work, though of course it was not, and praised discipline. And thinking that people became self-satisfied on account of their discipline, the Buddha deprecated it and extolled charity. In this way, he destroyed conceit and undermined pretentiousness. So there you are. There's somebody who's being very, very generous and is sort of all full of themselves. And that's where then the Buddha would say, oh yeah, just forget it, useless, you know. And then for those who, then he would say, you know, much better to practice discipline. Then for those who practice discipline and become very sort of, you know, proud of their particular discipline, then the Buddha would say, oh, much better to be generous. And this we can see this in various contexts. There's actually a very beautiful story. I think it might be in the words of my perfect teacher. And that's where there's one monk who's doing circumambulations, and this geshe comes along, this very wise geshe, and the monk who's doing circumambulations is really very sincere, but also thinking I'm very holy, and so that's where the geshe says to him, you know, it's very nice that you all do all these circumambulations, but you know, it would be better if you practice the Dharma. And then the monk is a bit sort of like, what? And then he said, okay, I'll practice Dharma. So he sits down, then he begins to do mandala offerings. And then the geshe say, yeah, it's nice you're doing mandala offerings, but you know, it'd be better if you do the practice the Dharma. And then you think, what can I do? What can I do? Or maybe I should sort of do something that invokes wisdom. So he begins to do copying texts, which is what one would do when one was studying, you know. And as he sits there copying text, and the geshe, of course, says to him, well, it's nice that you're copying these texts, but it would be really great if you practice the Dharma. And then finally, the monk just gives up and he just sits there and says, no, I don't know what to do. And then he just sits there quietly. And then in that sort of space of him just sitting there quietly saying, oh, the geshe says, oh, that's very nice. Now you're practicing the Dharma. But of course, that doesn't mean that the geshe was deprecating circumambulation, mandala offering, or copying texts. It was just according to that particular situation. So that's where there is this. Okay, there's another story which is really lovely, and that's more about on the line of discipline. And it's some of you would have heard this story. Paltra Rinpoche. He was wandering in the mountains as he would do in Tibet, and he came across this cave, and he looked inside, and there was a monk sitting in there, and Paltra Rinpoche says, hello, and the monk said hello, and Paltra Rinpoche says, do you mind if I come in? And the monk says, all right, okay, come in. And then he goes in and says, oh, this is a nice setup here, you know. What are you doing here? And he says, oh, I'm sitting here practicing the Buddha's teachings. Oh, says Paltra, that's really great. What are you practicing? And he says, well, I've been here for many years now, and I'm practicing the paramita of patience. And Paltra says, yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? And it always comes with getting lots of offerings, you know, as we're sitting here and we do our thing, we get lots of offerings, isn't it? Oh, it's so good. It's a really good deal. And the monk says, talk for yourself. What do you mean, getting offerings? What do you think? And get out of here. And then Paltra Rinpoche says, oh, what happened to your patience? So anyway, these are really just, you could say, skillful means, which are implicitly, of course, there's nobody here who's the Buddha is not trying to insult anybody, the geshe or Paltra Rinpoche are not trying to make anybody feel hurt. But what they are trying to get is get people out of something that is obstructing them. So that's where we have this example of this kind of implied teaching. So now we get to the next category within the teachings on the indirect teachings, which is a section of then the expedient teachings. So verse stanza 119 then reads, teachings that are indirect are those that express artfully in pleasing and engaging words what does not fit the minds of some and leads them into doubt, that the perfect path might be embraced. The words are on the level of their hearers, though their meaning is not so. These teachings are distinguished in 4 types: those for introducing to the path, those upon the nature of phenomena, those that are remedial, and those expressed in metaphors. So here then the teaching is about actually talking about, you could say, the nature of reality, but doing it so that people can actually follow, which, and this we'll look at this here. So Kangyur Rinpoche then comments, he says, in the so-called indirect teachings, the Buddha expressed himself in terms that are not to be taken at their face value. He acted in this way because if he had set forth subjects like the indivisibility of the two truths or the extraordinary qualities of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in straight and unvarnished terms, to people of limited capacity, their minds would have been unable to accept them, and they would have fallen into doubt. To people of this kind, who could not otherwise be introduced to such doctrines, the Buddha expressed himself artfully and with tact, using words and arguments that were engaging and liable to make an impression on his hearers. In order to direct them to an understanding of his wisdom intention, he taught in words that were on level with his hearers, even though his own true meaning was not. So that's where the Buddha is, this is like a doctor who's sensitive to the patient. You could very well have some guru that sits and says, well, I'm in bliss, and this is just so wonderful. I can't put it into words, but it is just wonderful. And just being here with me, it will, probably help you in some way. And that's a bit like if we went to the doctor and the doctor just said, oh, I'm so healthy. It's so good to be healthy. And that's where that's not particularly helpful for the patient that's suffering. What is helpful for the patient that's suffering is that the doctor actually addresses them where they are in their particular, you could say, their particular predicament. So that's where the Buddha talks, like, the Four Noble Truths, starting with suffering. It's not like the Buddha was suffering, but the Buddha was addressing people who were suffering and enabling them to understand the cause of suffering. So that's where the teacher is, the doctor, you could say, the physician is skillful when it's addressed to the audience or to the patients. So the Sutra Alamkara distinguishes 4 categories of indirect teachings. Indirect teachings aimed at introducing people to the path. 2, indirect teachings on the nature of phenomena. 3, indirect teachings connected with remedial methods. And 4, indirect teachings that are couched in metaphors. Okay, so we'll look at the first, indirect teachings aimed at introducing people to the path. So that's where then it says here, teachings given indirectly for the sake of introduction are aimed at Shravakas who, alarmed by emptiness, reject the Mahayana. Hearing there is form, they take it for existent and embark upon the path. Yet Buddha's meaning was that everything appears to us like dreams. So again, that's like the little bit like I was mentioning before with this, the juxtaposition between understanding our reality is made up of form or matter, substance, and understanding that it's in fact there is no foundation, or there's nothing solid, there is no substance, there's just endless causes and conditions. But that's where that might be too much for some. And so for some students, the Buddha said, oh yeah, there's subtle particles, basically atoms. And there is consciousness. Yes, there is consciousness, subtle moments of consciousness, And so that's where there still is this teaching that is aimed at eventually bringing individuals to understanding the, you could say, insubstantial nature of things, which is here given, presented as through the example of an illusion or a dream. So here Kangyur Rinpoche says, if from the first the Buddha had taught people of lesser capacity and aspiration the teachings of, for example, the Prajnaparamita Sutras, in which no self or the absence of inherent existence of phenomena is openly expounded, his hearers would have missed the point, namely that phenomena arise in interdependence. So that's where, if the Buddha right away talked about phenomena have no inherent true fundamental nature, they have no inherent existence, then people might just think, oh, then there's nothing. But that's not the fact. That's not the case at all. Phenomena arise, they appear, and we experience them, and we take them for real, even though they are, in fact, just interdependent, you could say, a web of causes and conditions. And that's where, if the Buddha had simply just taught the Prajnaparamita, taught about Prajna right away, then this assumption that this implies, oh, there's nothing, would have led to this extreme of nihilism. So that's where the Kangyur Rinpoche says, for such individuals, they would have taken the teaching as a nihilistic view of nothingness. And dismayed by both the words and the meaning, they would have rejected both the path and the teachings of the Mahayana. So that's where, the Buddha was skillful in going slowly. In one of the sutras, the Buddha therefore said, form, O Subhuti, has attributes. Sound has attributes. He thus made an assertion implying the existence of form and the rest, meaning the objects of consciousness as well as also the skandhas. The people listening to him were consequently not shocked, and in the belief that phenomena truly exist, they entered the path. And that's where, very often we have this sort of, in the modern context, you have this very orientalist, colonialist attitude that, we like Buddhism as long as it fits with our beliefs. One day I came across this YouTube with, there was one guy who says, what I really like about Buddhism is that you don't have to change what you believe. That's in a way for those who really hold on to their ideas. Then yes, the Buddha or the teacher will be very diplomatic and sort of just go as far as they can accept. So that's where you have this situation where this was the purpose of the Buddha's saying what he said, namely to not shock anybody. Yet, what the Buddha himself knew was that everything that appears to the deluded mind does so in the manner of a dream. So there is actually no reality, even though there is perception, appearance. Mipa Rinpoche here in this, in Kenju, he then just said about this, he says, the expression existing in the manner of a dream means that things exist only on the conventional level. So that's where we would say, well, there are things, there are tables and chairs and people and so on. Sure, on the conventional level, for sure, they appear. But the thing is, if we analyze, then we will find that they have no, you say, ultimate true existence. But for out of skill, then the Buddha went gently with that. 121. So that was then the next one. The indirect instruction on the threefold nature of phenomena, the imputed, the dependent, and the actual, were given that beings might grasp the absence of intrinsic being. The first reveals that things have no intrinsic nature. The second, that production too has no intrinsic nature. The third shows, likewise, that the ultimate has no intrinsic nature. Phenomena are thus described with deep and perfect words. So here we're looking at the essentially the Yogacarya teaching on what we call the three natures, which is, you could say, the dependent nature, which is our mind. And that, of course, are we going to say this mind really exists or not? Well, that's, here we would say, we can say it has a function in terms of our experience, but whether or not it has a reality, that's obviously where some would say it appears, but does have a reality, and others would say, oh yes, this dependent nature has a reality. But the thing is, this dependent reality or this dependent nature, it can be deeply ensconced in confusion, which is when we call it the imputed nature. And it can also be entirely free when we talk about it then as actual reality. But anyway, it's presented as these three natures. So here then Kangyur Rinpoche says, to say that phenomena in their fundamental nature, have no inherent identity, does not mean that they are completely lacking in existence, but that they are characterized by the three doors of liberation, which means they're empty, they're without characteristics, and they're not something that one achieves through wishing it. It's simply the nature of things. So that we call the three doors of liberation. And they're characterized by these three doors of liberation, for the understanding of which the three kinds of nature or reality were set forth. So, and that's where then there is this is then referred to as the indirect teaching of the threefold nature of phenomena, which is then just so these three aspects of understanding reality, it's very much what corresponds. In the general Mahayana we talk about the two truths, but then the Yogacarya actually have a very skillful way of explaining nature. You could say the two truths, where they take into account the mind that either falls into delusion or is free from delusion. And that's where we talk about the imputed reality and the actual reality that is really based on the dependent reality that can, you could say, go either way. But that's where then here, as it's explained here, this sort of asserting that there is something, that is what the Madhyamika, from the Madhyamika perspective, that's again an indirect teaching, because the Madhyamika, of course, would make a clear point that there's nothing that has any ultimate reality, and asserting these three, you could say, realities is just an imputed indirect teaching. So you could say it's simply just, you could say, a way to map experience, map samsara, map nirvana, how to map the path. And that's where it's seen as an indirect teaching, because it asserts this as a reality. So that's where then Kangyur Rinpoche says, first there is imputed reality, or reality as understood by ordinary beings. Second, there is dependent reality, the condition of phenomena as they arise through interdependence. So that's just simply things as they are. And thirdly, there is actual reality. In other words, the truly real emptiness beyond all conceptual constructs. Now, this is a little bit of this actually normally is sort of, I think last time I presented this schema that I've done, which I think helps a little bit. Let me just see. No, I don't have it here. Okay, never mind. Forget about that. But anyway, this is just where you could say there's an imputed, or there's an indirect teaching that then talks about, you could say, the way in which phenomena, the dependent reality, either is misunderstood or perfectly understood. So that's where then Kangyur Rinpoche says, on the level of the imputed or assumed reality of things, absence of inherent identity means that phenomena have no inherent existence at all. Phenomena that are merely mistaken perceptions have no reality whatever. This is exemplified by someone seeing a rope and thinking that it is a snake. So that's what we then refer to as the imputed reality. It's simply just misunderstanding reality. On the level of dependent reality, absence of inherent identity means that phenomena are unborn. For although phenomena seem to have origins, if they're analyzed, it will be found that none of the four possible kinds of origin applies to them. In this sense, they are like illusions. So that's simply talking about the nature of phenomena as they are. And that's where you say phenomena are not, I can think what I want about my watch or my hand or whatever. But that would be my projection onto it. the watch itself, phenomena in and of themselves, they don't fall into either being good or bad or in one way or another. So that's where we would say that reality that we attribute to them is not there. Phenomena are what we call unborn. And then on the level of actual reality, and that means when there's no more confusion, absence of inherent identity means that even the absolute truth cannot be said to exist inherently. This is so because the absolute is outside the range of concepts and predicates of impurity, purity, and whatever. It is like the unclouded sky. With these three realities in view, the Buddha gave profound teachings, difficult to fathom. He said, for instance, all phenomena, from form to omniscience, lack true existence. They have no origin. And that's where we then would say, if we begin to talk about the nature of this mind and its confused and unconfused state, then yes, then we're talking about an indirect teaching. But if we understand that this mind that falls into confusion or not is free from any reality, then of course, then we're talking more about the definitive teaching. Anyway, the bottom line really is that this depends on where you're coming from. And Kangyur Rinpoche says, the above is presented from the Madhyamika point of view, which regards the Buddha's teaching on the threefold nature of phenomena as expedient. So that's where the Madhyamika, they are more, if you use Western philosophical language, they're more ontologists. They're just looking at how are things. Whereas the Chittamatrans, who, bless their souls, were in, you could say, conversation with the contemporary Indians and so on. They actually would talk about the nature of experience. And as such, you could say they're more phenomenologists. They're more about experience. So that's where there needn't actually be a conflict between the two. And this is where, when we study Madhyamika, and particularly the various ways in which Madhyamika can be understood, we can see we can also accommodate this dimension of experience. Famously, we have Shantarakshita, who actually saw the unity of these two. One is ontological, one is, you could say, epistemological or phenomenological, more about the subjective engagement with reality. And that's where we have this fantastic work that's called The Adornment of the Middle Way. And that's which Wilson Fletcher has been teaching sort of over the last, here and there, over the last year or so. And it's such a valuable work. And that's where we can actually see how both in the Mahayana, both the Madhyamika and the Chittamatra have such incredible insights to contribute. Anyway, don't be put off if there's a bit of vocab here. And really, this is just talking about how the Buddha is skillful in presenting the teachings. So on one hand, then the Madhyamika would say that the teachings on how experience unfolds with the threefold nature, that is expedient. Would say this is just, you can say, teachings that are not absolute, but they're intending to get us there. Now, the Chittamatrans, those who actually expound this teaching, for their part, take the opposite view and affirm that it's rather Buddha's teachings on the absence of inherent identity that is expedient. And that's where the Chittamatrans, they're looking at experience. And they would say, well, for experience, when experience is diluted when we take things as being solid. And that's where, just like if we're sitting watching a movie and, we're sort of caught up, we're watching something that has us completely sitting at the edge of our seats. Don't know if anybody has ever watched Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Don't do that. It's terribly unnerving. Anyway, if you're watching a movie that has you completely freaked out, and then the Buddha very kindly comes and taps us on the shoulder and says, hey, it's just a movie. Then we kind of wake up, and it doesn't mean the movie goes away, but we just realize it's not real. It's all good. Nobody was harmed in this. And that's where for the Chittamatrans, then there is, there is a movie, there is a reality, but it's just we need to understand that it doesn't have the reality that we attribute to it. And that's where then for their part, they take the view that the Buddha's teaching on the absence of inherent identity is expedient. So in their view, when the Buddha said that the imputed reality lacks existence, he meant that there are no substances outside and separate from the mind. So that's where when the Buddha talks about lack of inherent existence, then he's really just talking about there's nothing except just the mind. This is, however, a little bit sort of if you really go into this discussion, it's interesting that there are various Chittamatrans, and most of them actually agree with the Madhyamikas. There's not really a conflict between the two. But when in the Tibetan tradition, when you talk about the different schools, such as Chittamatra, Madhyamika, and also Shochantika and Vibhashika, which we'll look at later, then there is a way of actually, you could say, defining their viewpoint. But they actually all work together very beautifully. Anyway, so it says when the Buddha said that dependent reality lacks true existence, he meant that the causes of phenomena are not found in themselves. And that's of course also something that we can observe. Anything that is a cause of something. Let's see, for example, let's say an apple tree comes from an apple seed. But you see, we cannot, then again, if we find where does the apple seed come from? Well, that comes from an apple that came from an apple tree and so forth. It goes back. And at the end of the day, we cannot find any origin. And that's where we would say causes as essentially existing, they don't exist. There's just, again, a web of causes and conditions that function together. So when the Buddha said that the actual reality does not exist, he meant that there is not something separate from the dependent reality. That means that there is, again, from the Chittamatran position, it means that this is actually fully understanding the nature of the dependent reality. This is the reason why he affirmed their lack of inherent existence. But this view is specific to the Chittamatrans and is not the same as the one just given. I hope this makes sense to some of you, but at the same time, like I said, this is really just talking about understanding the different teachings and where the Buddha was coming from, depending on who he was addressing. So at 122, the teachings given indirectly as remedial methods correct the false ideas that people have, declaring that his life, his lineage, and stature were both measureless. The Buddha's meaning was that all the Buddha's forms are equal in the Dharmakaya and equal likewise in accumulation and activities. Okay, this is a little bit specific to sort of the ideas that some that were, I guess, prevalent in the old days in India and at the time of the Buddha. That's where it's when people would see differences, the point was really to see, yes, on a relative level, sure, there are differences in how the Buddhas manifest, but it's not as if it makes a big difference, So that's where some people would be stuck on superficial aspects of the Buddha. So indirect teachings connected with remedial methods. And then Kangyur Rinpoche comments here, certain coarse and narrow-minded persons thought that of the 1,000 Buddhas who would manifest, the Buddha Shakyamuni was inferior due to the fact that, as it was reported in the Bhadrakalpita Sutra, his body was slight. His light radiated only to the distance of an arm's length. His following was meager and his lifespan short. It's true if you read some of the stories about Buddhas of past times and Bodhisattvas and so on, it's very impressive the way that they're presented. So some might say, well, Buddha Shakyamuni, hey, what's so special about him? And that's again That's why we need to go beyond appearances, right? So in order to correct such disparagement, the Buddha taught that the lifespan, lineage, and physical stature of the teachers are beyond measurement. So that you could say the true nature is beyond any sort of conceptual limitation. He was thinking of the fact that the Rupakayas, or you could say the manifest form of the Buddha, the Rupakayas of all the Buddhas are equal in appearing only for the benefit of beings, that they're equal in the unborn Dhammakaya, that they are equal in having perfected the two accumulations, and that they're equal in their enlightened activity, which is effortlessly deployed for the sake of others. You know, that's why we would understand that the way the Buddha appeared is on the basis of the merit of sentient beings. So that's also why sometimes we would say, you know, if we are, for example, Vajrayana practitioners, we would keep a pure view of the teacher, simply understanding that the teacher is nothing but the Dhammakaya manifested for our benefit. And that's why we would say to just think of the Buddha's appearance according to our particular karmic vision is actually diminishing the teacher, which has nothing to do with the nature of the teacher. So if we, for example, seeing that the teacher, you know, just looking at the teacher's sort of taste for food or the teacher's behavior and so on, then fine, then obviously then enlightenment is not what we're looking for. We're just looking for people who behave nicely or have a particular taste in food. But if we're looking for enlightenment, then we shouldn't be looking at the surface. We should be looking at the teacher's Dhammakaya, at the wisdom nature. And that's beyond any kind of external, you could say, form or behavioral aspect. So that's where it's so important that we actually appreciate that the way that the Buddha manifests has everything to do with our particular disposition, our particular capacity. So that's also where we would say, you know, in the earlier times, beings might have had a different degree of merit, and they might have seen teachers displaying incredible, you say, manifestations. And at other times, there was less merit, and then the teacher displayed according to that particular situation. You know, that's what Tsongtse Rinpoche, he'll say, you know, forget about the way that you hear about teachers in the sutras and so on. For you to be able to talk to your teacher, he has to appear to be somebody who's interested in soccer, or he has to be somebody who loves pizza and that sort of thing, which is not necessarily what appears in the scriptures, but that's simply just the way that the teacher then will appear according to the particular disposition of the students that he's teaching, i.e., people like us in the present time. So that's where we need to look beyond the appearances and appreciate the Dhammakaya, because even though the teacher might eat pizza, the teacher might like soccer, then what we really are interested in is the Dhammakaya of the teacher, the intangible, ultimate nature. So here then Kangyur Rinpoche says, likewise, in order to remedy contemptuous attitude towards his Dharma of transmission, the Buddha said, the ability to understand the Mahayana is the fruit of worshipping Buddhas equal in number to the grains of sand in the Ganges. He was thinking, so it is taught, of the Mahayana Dharma of realization. But he would nevertheless say, this is about, so we talk about the two Dharmas, which are the Dharma of transmission, which is, you could say, everything that we have heard, and then the Dharma realization, which is everything that we experience. So the first category constitutes all the Buddha's words, the sutras, the commentaries, and so on. The second is the actual living tradition of experienced individuals. And that's where, for some people, then he would say, oh, it's so important to understand the theory. But and then he says this, that you could begin to understand the theory. That's so wonderful. But in expressing it like he did here, he was actually more thinking of the incredible value of the Dharma of realization, which is what ultimately the Dharma of the theory takes you to. That's the purpose of the Dharma of the theory. Hey, there's some questions here. Maybe I'll just go over them. Yes. Yeah. When I think so, the question, first one is, I think Tongsa Gyalrong Rinpoche sometimes talks about provisional teachings. Would that be the same as indirect teachings? Indirect teachings and implied teachings are part of what is then known as the provisional teachings. The word that the translators here are using is the expedient teachings, that which brings us somewhere. But provisional teachings is the same thing. And then there's someone says that was a wonderful story. Okay, good. And then there is, in today's world, where Vajrayana teachings are available everywhere, are there still practitioners who consciously choose a lesser path? I have the impression that everything we learn today implies all levels, and that it would therefore be almost impossible in practice to genuinely and fully choose a lesser path. Could you comment on this? Well, this, of course, is coming from the Vajrayana perspective. But, and this is also something that Tongsa Rinpoche often emphasizes, we might just be happy with the Hinayana, or this, you could say, individual liberation. To just be, we needn't, if we really don't want to, we needn't begin to think in terms of wanting to enter the Bodhisattva's path. You know, the path of, you could say, the ultimate selflessness, the ultimate awakening. We might want to stay within parameters that seem safe and familiar, and just want to have a nice, you could just be happy, just be comfortable. And that's completely legitimate. That's also why in the Buddhist teaching, you know, there's not anybody who's like saying, oh yeah, mindfulness, you know, this should only be taught according to how we understand it in the Buddhist teaching, where, you know, mindfulness as shamatha is really just the tool for really getting to wisdom or vipassana. And that's where there's, you know, the Buddhists are completely fine with like one person mentioned, refers to it as Mac mindfulness. You know? So it's completely, we're completely free to choose a lesser path. But this particular teaching here, yeah, this is coming from the Mahayana perspective. So that's where, yes, we are free to choose whatever. Let me say, I have the impression that everything we learn implies all levels, and that it would therefore be impossible in practice to genuine fully choose. Yeah, it does put, you know, there is a hierarchy here. It is there, you know, in that it talks about, you know, what we could do, and there's less. There is the encouragement that we could, but it's also important to understand the value of the foundational paths and the value of, you could say, the teachings that might not necessarily apply to us, but really reflect the Buddha's skill in talking to different people, you know, and speaking their language. When mind become free of confusion, is it possible to revert to confusion again? That's a very good question. And we would say, when we're talking about perfect awakening, enlightenment, then we would say it's like being cured of jaundice. You know, if you've had hepatitis A, then you don't get it again. So, but at the same time, until reaching enlightenment, then it's very possible. You know, we can probably each and every one of us can see how sometimes we go up, you know, we have a bit less confusion, and then again we become prey to confusion. So we actually don't have some sort of like constant development towards a higher, you know, like somebody would say, you know, oh, I'm just born in this life to learn this, and then in the next life I will learn something else, as if there was some sort of predestination that we would keep improving. Absolutely no guarantee. We could very well be, you could say, confused today and less confused tomorrow, and the day after we can be confused again. So until we are completely free from samsara, we would say that it's very easy for us to revert to confusion. But once there is perfect awakening, then we don't fall into confusion again. And then there's a question here. In one of Tongsa Gyalme Khyentse Rinpoche's teachings, it occurred to me that the Buddha's different teachings are not only for different people, but that maybe for ourselves, certain teachings can be more or less adapted at certain times, depending on our state of mind and where we are in the path. Absolutely, so true. To be sincere in one's bodhisattva vow can, for example, feel very challenging at times from my own experience. Any comments or practical advice how to handle this? How do we know for ourselves how much we can take and not fool ourselves? Well, that's why we could actually appreciate. That's the thing. Very good question, and it's really it's really true that for us, as we're practicing on the path, we actually should see the value of all the different teachings. There's times when we simply need to abide by, you could say, the discipline of the that's very much emphasized in the Pratimoksha or the Hinayana teachings. And that's where, that's where we identify with the Shravakas or Pratyeka Buddhas. Sometimes it makes sense for us to push ourselves and apply the Bodhisattva teachings. And sometimes we can apply the Vajrayana teachings of seeing the purity of phenomena. So that's where the you could say the higher the teachings, the more actually there's appreciation for the lower teachings, so to speak. And we can see the relevance of the various teachings. And then there's a question here. So, is it good to have compassion toward all beings like me to be free? Absolutely. We should definitely have compassion for all beings and wishing them to be free. Yeah. Okay, a few minutes left. I think we can just finish this one here. Then there's indirect teachings expressed in metaphors. Okay, that's the last of the indirect teachings. And what is it again? 123. The teachings given indirectly in the form of metaphors, where it is said that one should slay one's parents, who should not be slain, destroy the ones who should not be destroyed, the sovereign and the two of pure life. These indicate things as craving, grasping, and the alaya. To understand them in their literal sense would be a great mistake. Now, this we very often have in the context of the tantric teachings, but we also have it in the Mahayana where it says, kill your parents. Oh my God, no. But what we're talking about is talking about the duality of grasper and grasp. Fixation that has to do with subjective delusion and that which is grasped, the way that we project onto objective phenomena. So that is what drives samsara. So this is referred to as our parents. So that's where in some, to really sort of get the listener going, kill your parents. That'll wake the audience up, So that's where then you can make the point of what actually the intention is. So it says here, Kangyur Rinpoche comments, in order to prevent people from saying things like Gautama the ascetic teaches unsolicited, this is where we sort of, people might say, oh, the Buddha is a missionary, No, that's not at all the case. The Buddha said, profound and peaceful, beyond all concepts, and so on. Actually, the quote goes, profound and peaceful, beyond all concepts. I have found a truth that is like pure nectar. If I were to expound it, no one would understand. Therefore, better that I stay quietly in the forest. We say that this is in the sutras that describe the Buddha's enlightenment, and that's where it actually says that it's very beautiful for us who come from a culture where we're a little bit adverse to the whole sort of idea of missionary, this sort of like hammering truth onto people, right? So that's where it's very beautiful that, in fact, that the Buddha then expressed this sort of just thinking, oh, I better not bother anybody. Yeah. And then it says, and in order to prevent people from saying, If he attains such excellence after a mere 6 years of ascetic practice, his Dharma must be easy indeed. The Buddha said, intending to introduce his hearers to profound teachings. And that's where we then have this sort of assumption that, oh yeah, 6 years? Oh yeah, I can do that. I'll spend 6 years and I'll attain enlightenment. That's where the Buddha then says something that sort of, you can say, blows the hearer's mind, where he says that one should kill one's father and mother. And of course, here in practice, it says whom one should not kill under any circumstances. He said, and so he said that, and then he says, liberation would be attained by those who bring down the king and the two classes of pure conduct, meaning Brahmins and virtuous ascetics, and by those who destroy both country and royal court, all of which are not to be destroyed, of course. We're talking, the essence of Buddhism is non-aggression or non-violence, right? But he said these things, and that's where Kangyur Rinpoche then says, actually, with these words, the Buddha was referring to craving and grasping and the alaya. So craving is okay, let's just see what the comments here says. So here it says, oh yeah, the two of the links of dependent arising. Oh yeah, Seba and Lemba. So craving and grasping. But basically the sort of, you could say, the way that the confused experience grasps and the alaya. So this is what needs to be killed. Craving, grasping, and the alaya. The alaya being the fundamental confusion. So that's where here then, there's a quote from this scripture called the Udana Varga, where the Buddha says, father, mother, slay them both. Your king, the two of pure life, the country and the royal court, destroy. Liberation is for those who do so. So, this has a very sort of, you could say, has a great appeal. If you're sort of an anarchist or in some way sort of, you want revolution, you want to, you want to, you want to sort of fight. Okay, well, here's something that you can fight. And that is then you could say the constructs of delusion. Go ahead. That's something you can struggle with. And so here from Dilgu Khyentse Rinpoche, there's a sort of an unpacking of what's being said here. It says, here, father and mother are to be construed as the interdependent links of craving and grasping, respectively. The king is to be understood as the alaya, while the two of pure life refers to the Brahmins who represent the view of I, the transitory composite, where we attribute, you could say, singularity to the experience, and then hence we have the idea of I. And to the virtuous ascetics who represent the wrong view of ethical and doctrinal superiority. This sort of represents sort of being very proud of one's ethics, setting absolutes. This is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. The country and the royal court refers to the senses and 8 dualistic consciousnesses. Again, the constructs of confusion. So that is what is being slayed. So that's where you could say the Buddha was very skillful in you could say catching the attention of the audience. But again, final word on this is, it would obviously be a calamitous mistake to take such words literally. Yeah, so I hope everybody's got that, right? Please, it's very important. All right, I think we'll conclude for today. No further questions? Okay. For all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.